I want to start this video by telling you the story of Kitty Genovese, with a bit of a trigger warning here as some of this story involves vague descriptions of violence and murder. You can, of course, skip ahead to the next slide if you need to. As reported by the New York Times in March of 1964, for more than half an hour, 38 respectable, law-abiding citizens in Queens, New York, watched a killer stalk and stab a woman in 3 separate attacks. Twice, the sound of their voices and the sudden glow of their bedroom lights interrupted him and frightened him off. Each time he returned, sought her out, and stabbed her again. Not one person telephoned the police during the assault. One witness called after the woman was dead. Now, why did this happen? If there were so many people who witnessed this crime happening in real time, why didn't anyone intervene? This is known as the Bystander Effect, or Bystander Nonintervention, and has for many years been of interest to social psychologists. In this video, we'll discuss what the Bystander Effect is, why it happens, and how we can combat it when it comes time to help someone in need. Let's begin. The bystander effect is a phenomenon in which a witness or bystander doesn't volunteer to help a victim or a person in distress, and instead simply observes what is happening, as a bystander does. Directly relevant to the bystander effect is what I call the helping paradox, the surprising finding in psychological research that the more people there are around during an event in which someone is in need of help, the less likely it actually is that they'll receive help. I call this a paradox because this is surprising. You'd assume the opposite, that more people would mean a greater opportunity for at least one of those people to be kind enough to help. But this isn't what we find in the research. So let me tell you about 3 studies that illustrate this paradox. In one study, a participant came to a laboratory to participate in a research study. Several other participants, actually Confederates or trained undercover experimenters, were there as well. Smoke begins to fill the room, coming from behind a door that connects to the lab. And how do the real participants react? Well, let's take a look. When participants were alone, that blue bar here, over 3/4 of them responded to the emergency, for example, by getting help or whatever. When the participants were in a group, however, when there were other Confederates, other people in the room who did nothing, less than 1/10 of the actual participants responded to the emergency. This is the helping paradox, and hopefully it's clear to see how failing to respond to a potential fire could be quite dangerous. So bystander non-intervention is something that is important to address. We see the same pattern of results in a second study in which, instead of a fire, there's a woman, again an actor, who is clearly in distress, calling out for help, all of that stuff. When alone, a substantial percentage of people helped, but in a group, this percentage dropped significantly, to a similar extent as the laboratory smoke study. And finally, we replicate these effects using a similar paradigm involving a fellow student having a seizure. When people are alone, over 80% help the student who is seizing, but when other people are around, only 1/4 that amount do. So again, this is the helping paradox, and I think it's very counterintuitive. Okay, so why does this happen? What can explain this helping paradox? One factor is known as pluralistic ignorance, the error of assuming that no one in a group perceives things the way we do. If you're sitting in a laboratory and smoke begins to fill the room, you might immediately assume there's a fire. If you're alone, you're probably going to get help. But if there are several other people there and no one else is responding, you might think to yourself, you know what, maybe I'm mistaken. It must not be a fire because no one else here seems worried, so it must be something else that I just don't know about. It's probably fine. The problem here is that when everybody around is thinking that same thing, no one ends up helping even though there might be a real emergency. This is the danger of pluralistic ignorance. A second explanation is that in a large group, people experience diffusion of responsibility, which you may have experienced if you've ever worked on a large group project or any sort of teamwork. Diffusion of responsibility refers to a reduction in feelings of personal responsibility when other people are around. If there are 30 other people witnessing a crime, you might not feel like you personally need to intervene. There are lots of other people around, surely someone else will call the police, right? Again, this can be problematic if everyone around is thinking the same thing. So now we know why people don't help when help is needed, but what does the psychological literature tell us about the causes of helping? What causes us to help? Research shows that all of the following, I'll give you a little list, increase the likelihood that a person intervenes when someone is in need of help. First, being unable to escape the situation. If you're literally locked in a room or an elevator with somebody who's seizing or having some kind of an emergency, you're much more likely to help them compared to if you're just passing by, for example. Second, not being in a rush. If you have nowhere to be, you'll probably help. If you're passing by and you have an appointment in 20 minutes or whatever, you're much less likely to help. So not being in a rush helps quite a bit. Third, being in a good mood, which we can manipulate experimentally. You can bring people into the lab and give them some great bogus feedback. You did so amazing on this task, and send them on their way. And then in the hallway on their way out, there's someone in need of help who's actually, again, an actor. But it turns out that simple manipulation of bringing people in this positive state, positive mental state, into a good mood, that's going to make it much more likely that they'll help that person in the hallway, versus if you give them bad feedback, or if they aren't, if their mood isn't manipulated at all, then that's a good control condition as well. So being in a good mood increases the likelihood that you'll help as well. Fourth, being less concerned about social approval. If you're worried about what everyone else is going to think, you're going to sit in that room quietly, not to make waves, not to mention the smoke, because you don't want to stand out. You don't want to be mistaken or be embarrassed for getting it wrong, right? But if you're someone who doesn't really care what other people think, you're going to speak up and you're going to say, guys, I think there's smoke over there. Should we do something? Next, we have being extroverted. And finally, less surprisingly, having a medical background. You're literally trained in helping people who are in a state of emergency, so this makes a big difference as well. Now, the very last one's a little bit different, but it's perhaps the most encouraging for me. Research shows that you are significantly more likely to help someone in need if you've been exposed to research on bystander non-intervention. So congratulations.